So I'm going to talk to you about tuning in, or what I call mind-mindedness, and hopefully by the end of the talk you'll know what mind-mindedness is. So I'll start by giving you a bit of background to how I developed the construct and how I've defined the construct and why I'm interested in this attunement to what babies are thinking or feeling. So I actually started my research career with attachment as the framework. So you're probably all very familiar with John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth's work. Bowlby's theoretical ideas about the importance of the attachment relationship forming a prototype for relationships for the rest of your life, and Mary Ainsworth's work on how we define and how we operationalise different patterns of attachment. And that's where I basically started my research career. I started assessing attachment and then seeing whether and how attachment predicted children's later development. And basically, I think actually attachment has become a bit of a victim of its own success. So there are attachment explanations for every single psychopathology or mental disorder you can think of. There's also attachment explanations for physical health, things from leg ulcers to cancer. There are published studies saying it's something to do with attachment. Things about how religious people are, whether you're satisfied with customer service. I kid you not. There have been all of these things that have been explained in attachment frameworks. And it's almost like the kind of first thing people reach for and take down off the shelf if they find people vary on anything. Now, clearly, you can't have one thing that explains absolutely everything. And it's just as important to say, right, okay, what do we think this construct shouldn't predict as what do we think it should predict? Also, for the kinds of things I'm interested in, so say, for example, early cognitive development in children, I don't really think there are any good reasons for saying attachment should predict it. And if people try and explain why attachment might predict children's cognitive development, typically what they do is they say, oh, well, mothers of securely attached children do X, Y, and Z. So they're not actually framing their explanation in terms of the attachment relationship themselves or itself. They're actually framing it in terms of the parenting associated with attachment. And so I started thinking, well, why don't we just look directly at the parenting and what the parents are doing rather than have to kind of put it in this attachment context. As I'm sure you're all aware, you can't assess attachment until the child is at least 12 months of age. So that ignores that first crucial year of life, which I'm sure we all agree is incredibly important. And so I started thinking about whether or not actually things that have been linked with attachment in the past might actually be indirect. So if we look at the stuff that's going on in that first year of life and we measure that, maybe those things will predict children's development down the line. So I actually published this earlier in the year. So I said that the predictive power of attachment was overrated in the Psychologist magazine. I thought I might have to wear a flak jacket or something having published this. But actually, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and lots of practitioners and clinical psychologists and people working with families have emailed me saying, thank you so much for publishing this, because in my service, all people are interested in is attachment. So what do I do if I'm not kind of using attachment? Well, my approach is broadly Vygotskian. What does that mean? This is Lev Vygotsky. He's a Soviet psychologist, really, really fascinating life. Died very young, age 37 in 1934, and a lot of his work was then actually repressed under Stalin. So it's only really since the 1980s that people in the West have become aware of Vygotsky's ideas. And what Vygotsky was saying is that you can't understand cognitive development unless you know something about the child's social environment. So he would say that social interaction with other people, it might be your caregivers and your parents, but it might be other children. This is a real driver for the child's cognitive development. And he was also incredibly interested in the role of speech and conversation. So you've probably all experienced young children talking out loud to themselves when they're playing, this kind of thing, yeah? So That's what Vygotsky would call private speech. So his idea is you kind of have these social conversations and you then start internalizing them and talking to yourself out loud, and then we internalize it to this voice in our head that helps guide us in any kind of tasks that we do. So for Vygotsky, any kind of cognitive development has its roots in the social environment. So I then started thinking what sorts of early social interaction and conversational exchange between parents and children might be important and might have this role that Vygotsky was saying in facilitating and boosting children's cognitive development. And I, quite by accident, came across interesting differences in parents' ability to take the intentional stance with regard to their child. What does that mean? In other words, to what extent do parents treat their child as an individual with a mind of their own? And the first kind of accidental find, these are both things I did way back in my PhD, was I wanted to get a measure of children's vocabulary development, so their language development. And a really good way to do this is to get parents to do a diary study. So the parents will write down the words that their child can understand, write down the words that their child can say, and so on and so on. So the idea is that every time they come into the lab for a visit, you'll get this kind of cumulative growth of their vocabulary. But what was really interesting was that some mums would come in and say, look, I'm really sorry, I know mick isn't a real word, but when my son says mick, he means music. So we had about a third of parents who had what we call non-standard words, right? So they weren't real English words or whatever language they were speaking, weren't real words in that language, but nevertheless these parents were systematically saying, that is being used to mean X when my baby says it. Conversely, we had some parents who would come in empty-handed and say, all gobbledygook, can't understand the word he's saying, he's not speaking at all. And yet when I was testing the child, I'm thinking, I'm sure he said duck there or ball or whatever it might be. So I seemed to be interpreting the child's vocalizations as having meaning and the parents weren't. So I suddenly thought, isn't that interesting? Some parents will give kind of meaning to stuff that seems nonsense. Other parents have to have exactly beautifully pronounced words in order to attribute meaning to them. And the second thing I did was I was actually originally interested in the mother's language. So I wanted to just get them talking so I can look to see at the grammatical complexity of their language, how long their utterances were, this kind of thing. But the thing I asked them to get them talking was, can you describe your child for me? And the kids were 3 at this age. And I'm going to give you some of the actual responses that I got from these mums. So here's the first one. He was my 3rd child. He's about, how tall would he be? He's slightly taller than average for his age. He's fairly thin, not a lot of beef on him. He has mousy coloured hair. He has greeny spongy eyes, nice eyelashes, fairly long face, pretty pale coloured, a bit of a giggler, cut all his teeth, has a good sense of humour, bit of a cough, full of fun really I suppose, quite boisterous. So lots of detail, but practically all physical or a bit of behaviour, yeah? Here's the second one. He's about 3'3" high, blonde hair, dark brown eyes, very long eyelashes, very small face, but a big build for his age. Size 10 feet. He's got the front left tooth black because he fell on it as a 2-year-old. He's got a birthmark on his left-hand shoulder. He's got the birthmark of a hemangioma on the back of his left leg. He's a pain in the neck. And she actually laughed herself after she said that. He's just started to sleep 3 months ago through the night, and I think he's very bright for his age. So again, huge detail. We know about the kid's birthmarks and his left tooth being black, but again, almost purely physical about the child. Here's the last one. I think she's a vivacious, just 3-year-old. She's got quite a strong personality, but she's very sort of a loving, caring little girl, really. And well, she's become a real companion now. Don't know what else to say about her, except she's a lovely little girl, quite independent, plays on her own quite a bit once she gets herself organised, and her imagination's just started sort of to take off. And I hear her playing games with her animals and things and talking to them. She's great fun to be with. So it's like you asked her a different question, yeah? It's not gender, by the way. I'll lay that fear for you. This little girl, we don't know if she's tall or short or dark or blonde or whatever, but we know what it would be like to have a chat with her, to get down on the floor and play with her. So this really struck me as being interesting. So some parents spontaneously, immediately represent their child in terms of what makes them tick, the kind of person they are. Other parents, and these are 3-year-olds, and we know how well-rounded 3-year-olds are, will just give you a kind of physical description of their child, or maybe talk about their child's behaviours. So this was really interesting, and this is the kind of jumping off point for mind-mindedness. So I started wondering whether individual differences in caregivers' attunement to their children as kids with things with minds of their own, their attunement to their thoughts and feelings and so on, might be a more interesting framework for development. Right, so I'll tell you how we measure and define mind-mindedness. I'll then tell you a bit about how it relates to children's development, and I'll finish up by telling you about some of our most recent work where we've been trying to teach parents to become more mind-minded. Okay, so it's 20 years old, mind-mindedness as a construct, this year. And basically, it's the caregiver's tendency to treat their young child as an individual with a mind of their own. And it enables the caregivers to tune in to what the child might be thinking or feeling. So how do you measure it? Well, as you've seen, you can simply just ask your parent to describe their child or tell you a bit about their child, and you'll get nice variation in the extent to which they talk about the child's cognition and intellect and mental stuff and emotional stuff. It's a very easy way to do it. But we also wanted to know whether or not you can assess mind-mindedness from actual online interactions. When parents are really there in the moment interacting with their child, can you assess mind-mindedness? And we also wanted to know, how early do you see it? So as I said, 3-year-olds are very well-rounded and can tell you what they like and don't like and what makes them tick themselves. Do parents do this from birth? Or is it not until the child starts, walking or talking that parents start showing mind-mindedness? So we wanted to know how early in life we see it. So what we did was we got a bunch of mothers and their 6-month-olds into the developmental lab and just said, play with your baby, as you would do if you had spare time together at home. And we just filmed them to see, first up, do parents actually talk about their child's thoughts, their likes, their dislikes, what they want, what they, if they're happy, and that kind of thing when they're actually interacting with their young babies. So do they talk about all this kind of stuff? And something which I hadn't really thought about at the outset was, if they do say the child wants this or likes it, do they actually seem to get it right? And this kind of accuracy has turned out to be really crucial in what we found. So we've distinguished 2 types of comments. So we have appropriate mind-related comments. So that's you as an external observer say, yeah, I think you got that right. So maybe the child gestures towards something and the parent might say, oh, you want the ball. So they see that gesture as a desire for something. Or if the child's looking kind of really, pensive and fascinatedly looking at an object or a toy or something, the parent might say, oh, you're very interested in that, or you're fascinated by that, or even stuff like, are you making a decision about how it works? Conversely, sometimes you feel that the parent has misattributed the child's thoughts or feelings. So for example, and these often kind of come from when the parent's wanting to impose their own agenda on the child. So maybe the child's playing with a toy and is still interested in a toy, but the mum wants the child to play with something else. So she might take the toy off the baby and say, oh, you don't want that anymore. You're bored with that now. Here, you want this new thing. So it's kind of her projecting her desires onto the child rather than actually responding to the child's actual desires. And I always give the example of the most striking non-attuned comment I've ever seen is I was over in the States doing some stuff with Jude Cassidy, and she had been looking at a sample of young mothers who were also at risk of domestic violence. She said, I just want to show you this clip. And so it was a really tiny baby, looked kind of weeks old, in a car seat, looking really, really sleepy, about to fall asleep. And so the mum first said, oh, are you tired? And I thought, seems perfectly fine. Baby didn't change at all, but didn't do anything. And the mum said, no, I think you're just really mad at me. So she interpreted that lack of response as the baby being mad at her. And you can imagine that that would be really pernicious for a relationship if you're thinking lack of response means my baby hates me or is mad at me. So happily, most non-attuned comments aren't as worrying as those, but you can imagine if you do this level of misinterpretation, it can set the relationship off on the wrong foot. So I'll show you some. Is this going to work for that? No, it's not. I'm going to have to go over here. So I'm going to show you some clips. So these are mums on their 8-month-olds.
Are you getting all excited? He's in a door. He's in a lot of the teddies. What? What can you say? Oops, plunk. Plunk.
So did you spot the mind-related comment? Excited, yeah. So the little girl squeals and she said, oh, are you getting all excited? Which seems perfectly appropriate. It's kind of joyful squealing. If she'd said, oh, are you scared? Then that would have been non-attuned. If she'd just said, oh, be quiet, it wouldn't be mind-related. But she's interpreted that joyful squealing as my baby's excited. And I agree with her, so we'd say that was an appropriate mind-related comment. Here's another one. I'm sorry, they vary in volume, but so she says at the end, you're tired, you lady. Doesn't seem tired, seems disinterested in the thing that she's shaking at the child. And if a parent says tired, you look through the whole thing, is the baby yawning, rubbing their eyes? Is there any kind of signs of tiredness? If there's not, and the parent says you're tired, it's non-attuned. So that's a kind of, she's interpreting the fact you're not responding to me as you must be tired. It's not like you just want to do your own thing rather than be interested in what I want you to be interested in. Here's another one.
Oh, baby. Come here. What? Come here. You just bash yourself. Bash yourself. It's all right. It's all right. It's all right. You're okay. You're just miserable and tired, aren't you?
So there we've got a miserable and tired, but he's actually cracked his head. That's why he's crying. So, and that's a nice example because behaviourally she's being very sensitive. She's comforting him, she's trying to soothe him, but yet she's kind of reframing, this is why my child's upset, to say, oh, you're miserable and tired. It's not because you've actually hurt yourself. And here's the last one I'm going to show you.
Isn't that your favourite one? Yeah. Where you going? Where you going? One there a minute. Oh, wow. Oh, it's fine.
So she says, isn't that your favourite one? But I'm going to take it off you. So that's the kind of opposite end where someone's making an appropriate comment. She knows he's interested in the radio and that's his favourite thing. Actually, the poor little boy, the whole session, all he wants to do is play with the radio. But she takes it off him. So sometimes, basically it's different from sensitivity. You can have someone who's being sensitive but making a non-attuned comment. You can have someone who's making an appropriate comment but who's not particularly sensitive. So, interestingly, appropriate comments and non-attuned comments are unrelated. It might have been that they were negatively related, but they're not. They seem like they're on different dimensions. So I always say you get 2 for the price of 1 if you look at both types of comments because they're not related. It seems to be they're slightly different facets of this attunement to the baby's thoughts and feelings. So you can have some parents who are quite high on both. So often, if a parent is on track and is with the baby, then they might make lots of appropriate comments. But if she's then trying to impose her own agenda, she might do lots of non-attuned comments. You can have some parents who are just kind of low on both, so essentially they don't really engage much at all with the baby's internal states. And then you can have people who are high on one and low on the other. So you can actually have kind of 4 quadrants, if you like, of how parents can use the different types of comments. So a mind-minded caregiver, therefore, can do lots of the appropriate comments or just do very few of the non-attuned comments. And actually, you get a sizable minority of parents, around a kind of quarter of parents, who never make a non-attuned comment, whereas appropriate comments are much less rare. So there's only, in our studies, 3% of parents have never made an appropriate comment. So all parents talk about their baby's internal states. They're more likely to do it in an appropriate way, but these non-attuned comments in some ways are more interesting. They're almost more diagnostic of a kind of lack of attunement. So that's all interesting, but does it predict anything? So over the past, getting on for 30 years now, I've been doing longitudinal studies where we started in the first year of life and tried to predict children's development down the line. So mind-mindedness does predict positive aspects of children's development. So if you've got a mind-minded parent, you're more likely to then have a secure attachment relationship with that parent. So this is stuff we've found in various different samples in our lab, but also Brenda Lundy in the States has similarly found this. So appropriate comments predict secure attachment. Non-attuned comments predict insecure attachment. Also, stuff we've done and also stuff that Annie Bernier and colleagues have done over in Canada has shown that mind-mindedness predicts children's early language and play development. So appropriate comments relate to better language and play at age 2 typically. Non-attuned comments relate to poorer language and play development at age 2. And Annie's group have also shown that kids who have mind-minded caregivers also have better early behavioural control. So they're better at regulating themselves at age 2. Over the slightly longer term, so starting in the first year of life and going to sort of 4 or 5, if you had a mum who was good at reading your mind, children are better mind readers. So you've probably all heard of theory of mind. Yeah, theory of mind tasks and stuff, where you get children to, you ask children whether or not they understand how what we believe to be true is actually the thing that governs our behaviour. Children who had mind-minded caregivers in the first year of life are better able to understand other people's thoughts and feelings when they're ages 4 and 5. And I'm going to say a bit more about some effects that we've seen specifically in children from disadvantaged backgrounds, which I find particularly interesting and exciting. So the first thing we looked at was behavioural difficulties, which obviously is a kind of crucial thing. It's probably a crucial thing for you guys as well. So if kids have problems regulating their behaviour early on, that's going to make things difficult for them. So it's going to make things difficult in terms of relationships with their caregivers and their peers. It's going to make it more difficult for them to benefit from school and all this kind of stuff. So it's really important to try and work out what might predict better behavioural control and fewer behavioural difficulties. So we had a very socially diverse sample of just over 200 mothers and children that we actually recruited up in the Tees Valley, so Stockton-on-Tees, Middlesbrough area. And we had just under half of these families, 90 families, from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. So these were families where both parents had no post-16 education. Both parents were either unemployed or in menial or manual employment. The mothers were significantly younger and had significantly less social support. So it was a kind of objectively disadvantaged group. And actually, it was a really interesting place to do research because it's very polarised. So there's some of the kind of poorest estates in the country around Middlesbrough and Stockton, but also people took part from, Yarm and really leafy affluent areas of North Yorkshire. So a much more kind of socially diverse sample than you'd normally get. We assessed behavioural difficulties at age 3. The mother reported on the child's behavioural difficulties, and at age 5 in the first year of school, the mother and the child's teacher reported on behavioural difficulties. And you typically distinguish between what we call internalizing difficulties. So these are things like social withdrawal, anxiety, problems with kind of getting on with peers in a kind of, being bullied kind of way. So they're the kind of victim of the relationship. Or externalizing behaviors, which are things like acting out, hyperactivity, conduct problems, and so on. And we wanted to know whether families' socioeconomic status moderated any relation. So in other words, do you get effects more for the disadvantaged group than the advantaged group? And we know, for instance, that low socioeconomic status is an important predictor of behavioural difficulties. So kids growing up in disadvantaged families are much more likely to present with behavioural difficulties than kids from more affluent families. So I'm going to show you a really scary diagram. Don't worry, I'll explain what it means. So what we did is, we have mind-mindedness, appropriate mind-related comments at age 8 months. Then we have the kids' behavioural difficulties, internalising and externalising at age 3, and then the same thing at age 5. Okay, so we want to know, is mother's early attunement, is their early mind-mindedness predicting fewer behavioural difficulties? That's what we were really interested in seeing. So this is the thing. So we've got appropriate mind-related comments over here. Is the thingy working there? So these are the two important bits. So for kids growing up in socioeconomic disadvantage, having a mother who tuned into you in the first year of life makes you less likely to have externalizing and internalizing problems at age 3, which then predicts those problems when you start school. Okay? What about the high group? Nothing. So this was a specific effect for kids growing up in poverty. So for the middle class kids in the more affluent backgrounds, specifically for their behavioural difficulties, it didn't matter whether you had a mother who was tuned in. But for the kids growing up who are already under stress in the family environment, having a parent who could tune into you was really important in helping them kind of buck the trend of presenting with more behavioural difficulties. So mind-mindedness in the first year of life appears to protect kids from poor backgrounds against behavioural difficulties. And those scary diagrams I showed you control for things like maternal depression, maternal sensitivity, social support, and also children's early language, all of which are known to predict behavioural difficulties. So it was a surprisingly robust effect. So what mums are doing in that first year of life, how they're talking to their children about their internal states, was predicting on top of all this other stuff. So then I thought, wonder if it goes longer. Wonder if it relates to other things where we know poor kids are at a disadvantage. And one of those, as you'll know, is educational attainment. So we wanted to know, does mind-mindedness then predict educational attainment further down the line for poor kids versus more affluent kids? So there's this lovely thing called the National Pupil Database, which some of you might know about. So you have to jump through a whole heap of hoops to show that you're not going to do anything dangerous with the data. But then they will give you the data for kids' SATs attainment. And we asked for the SATs results for these children at ages 7 and 11. So there's an average attainment score at 7, and then we had reading and maths scores at ages 11. So do you get the same poverty-specific effect? So in other words, is it for the poor kids, how tuned in your mum was to you early in life, does that predict better educational attainment? And I have to say, this was a bit of a long shot for me. I was thinking, it would be really, really interesting and great if it happened. But I got the data and then I was too scared to look at it for quite a while in case there was nothing interesting there. But I'm glad I did. Because for the poor kids, the mother's appropriate comments in the first year of life was predicting their reading scores specifically at age 7 and 11. And again, it's only in the poor kids, it's only in the low socioeconomic status group. And these associations were independent of children's early behavioural difficulties. So the stuff I just talked about at 3 and 5, we controlled for that. We thought that might actually be the mechanism through which appropriate mind-related comments might predict educational attainment. It's not, it's actually direct. It's also over and above children's early verbal IQ, which again predicts their educational attainment. So it's really quite extraordinary. What mothers are saying to their babies in the first year of life is predicting their reading attainment at age 11 in kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. And if you told me that was true, I think I probably wouldn't have believed you until I actually found it myself. So, how am I doing for time? Okay. Can you teach people to be more mind-minded? I'm going to talk to you about 2 ways in which we've done this. We've used individually administered video feedback, which is a technique that some of you might be familiar with, for mothers hospitalised for severe mental illness. So this is actually stuff that my old PhD student, Robin Schacht, did. She's a qualified clinical psychologist, and then she came to do a PhD, so she's really, really well qualified to do this work. So we worked with the mother and baby unit at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in South London, and as part of their normal procedures, they filmed mothers interacting with their babies for 5 minutes when the mothers were admitted to the unit and were well enough to take part in the observation. This was great for us because we could assess from that face-to-face interaction mothers' mind-mindedness. So we looked to see the extent to which mothers talked about their babies' internal states, their thoughts and feelings, and how appropriate or non-attuned they were. And we compared these mums with a psychologically healthy control group. So these were women who'd never had any kind of diagnosed mental disorder, never been hospitalised for anything like that, and so on. So first up, do you see differences in mind-mindedness between mothers with really severe mental illness and psychologically healthy controls? And as you're probably aware, there's only 125 beds for the whole of the UK on mother and baby units. So these mothers are really, really severely ill and in need of the most severely ill in the whole country. So fewer appropriate comments in the mentally ill mums than in the control groups. But what's really striking is the very elevated level of non-attuned comments in the mothers with severe mental illness. So in other words, these mothers were misinterpreting their baby's thoughts and feelings an awful lot. So, you know, 4-fold increase compared with the psychologically healthy mums. So we then wanted to know, can we do something with these mothers that will make them more mind-minded? So we used the admission videos to pick out moments that could be used in a video feedback session. So the developmental psychologists on the unit would watch the admission videos and choose 3 moments in advance of the video feedback session. So these might be things when the baby changed state, so maybe from being content to crying or vice versa, maybe when the mother made an appropriate or a non-attuned comment. So the psychologist could talk to the mother about what was going on. And in these moments, what would happen is the video would be stopped and the psychologist said, if your baby could talk, what would he or she say to me now? So it was really trying to get the mother to put herself in her baby's shoes. They were filmed at discharge, and again, we could assess the observations for mind-mindedness. And here we didn't just compare against psychologically healthy controls, we also compared against mum who'd been on the same unit, who'd also had a video feedback session, but it wasn't anything to do with facilitating mind-mindedness. So these were mums who were just as ill, but who'd had a different kind of care programme. So these are appropriate. So that's our controls, they're the psychologically healthy lot. That's the standard care. That's the admission data for the intervention group, discharge, and that's a significant increase, okay? So for specifically the intervention group mothers, having this video session made them more likely to make appropriate comments about their baby's internal states between admission and discharge. The standard care group, although they've gone up, it's not actually a significant increase, and they're still significantly lower than the psychologically healthy control groups. So this is still significantly lower than this on discharge. Same thing for non-attuned. So can we get that really elevated level down? Yes. So that's a significant decrease there, specifically in the intervention group. And at discharge, the intervention group were no different from the control group, which is quite amazing actually, considering how elevated they were. Standard care group are interesting. They're really, really low, and on discharge, they're still significantly lower than the psychologically healthy controls, which suggests that this group weirdly just don't talk about their children's internal states at all, and certainly the intervention had no kind of impact on that. Yes, so that's significant. So obviously, video feedback, really labour intensive, not something you can do widely with parents. So we wanted to know, with a light touch kind of thing, not face-to-face, can you still get a facilitative effect? So we developed this Baby Mind smartphone app, and we've trialled it over in New York in the Baby and Me study. So what does the app do? Well, there's 4 different buttons: My Baby, the journal, the alerts, and the info. So when the mum gets the app, she can personalise it for her baby. She puts the baby's name in, baby's sex, baby's date of birth, and the age at the bottom will kind of update as the baby gets older. Info. This links up to a website we created, which is really user-friendly, which is aimed at kind of parents. So if they wanted more information on any of this stuff, they can just go and access it on the website. And every day, the parent will get an alert. And it will be a piece of information based on evidence from the psychological literature about what babies who are exactly the same age as your baby can or can't do. So here's some examples. So before Jamie can count, he's an understanding of more and less. And once a week, they get a little cartoon that has something talking on the baby's behalf. So this baby's saying, hooray, it's dinner time. Okay? So they're really kind of basically saying, look what clever stuff babies of your age can do. Did you know that this is what babies can do? This is their psychological development. Journal. So every day as well, parents get an alert. So what is on Isaac's mind, or whatever your baby's name is. And then the idea is that they post a photograph or a bit of video so we can see it. So this is the kind of thing that would be great. So Jamie loves this new book. We read it about 10 times this morning. So here we've got loves. So it's about the child's internal states. They're interpreting wanting to do the same thing over and over again as the baby really enjoying and loving this kind of thing. So that seems perfectly appropriate. The parents themselves can share that. So if they want to send the post to the dad or their mom or dad or their friends or whatever, they can do. So we now have our admin panel. So somebody posts something, one of these green buttons will go red and we'll know there's a post. We'll click on it and this is the kind of thing we'll see. So it says, Nina was very surprised to see a squirrel with an emoji. And so here we type in our response that the parents see. So here we've just said, oh, what's that? As if we were Nina. And I have to say, it's the most fun I ever have academically. It's responding to the posts, because if you've got a parent who just gets it, then you just pretend you're the baby. So they then see our response here. So Jamie's enjoying eating her toes. Yummy. So it's very interactive. They post stuff, we see it. We post stuff back, they see our response, and so on. Oh, and at the end of the week, they get a word cloud summarising their posts. So to evaluate the app's efficacy, we had a group who we recruited antenatally. So as soon as the baby's born, they can start using the app and they'll get alerts and they'll get prompts to post every day. We actually had some people using it in pregnancy, which was fascinating. We then followed them up at 6 months and assessed their mind-mindedness and the kind of interaction like the clips I've shown you. And then we have groups who start at 6 months who haven't had our app, who act as a control or comparison group. Does it work? These are preliminary results on 70 odd, I can't remember exactly how many. So not a huge sample, but not a really titchy sample. We've got just over 200 parents. So these are the app users, and those are the controls. So the app users use significantly more appropriate comments than the controls. And they use significantly fewer non-attuned comments than the controls. So, fingers crossed, it looks like it works. So this kind of really light touch thing where you give a bit of psychoeducation and you prompt parents to talk about their baby's internal states and you give them a bit of feedback makes them more mind-minded. And we've also done stuff with health visitors where we've developed activities and materials to help facilitate mind-mindedness, which I've done all this stuff with health visitors in North Yorkshire. And this stuff can be delivered individually or in groups. So I think there's potential to do other stuff to facilitate mind-mindedness. Have I got time to show a clip? Or 2 minutes? It's about 2 minutes. So this, All in the Mind on Radio 4 actually interviewed one of the mums from the mother and baby unit who had taken part. And so I'm just going to play you what she said about being in the study.
When we look back at the video, it's the first time that I saw my reaction to him. I tried to communicate with him, and I remember that he was rather saying, oh, you know, poor you, when you're crying, and it was my tone of voice, and I think words. And it's the first time actually that I actually thought, well, how would I feel if I was looking back at that face and hearing that voice, and I'd feel a sense of sadness. That's not a way we need to communicate with him. I used to think, well, he's just a baby. I didn't think that they had those kind of emotions, and at the time I thought, I'm feeding him, he's clothed, and I respond to him when he cries. And if you think, well, that's enough, and meeting those responsibilities, and therefore I'm a mother, and that should be enough, and the rest will just fall into place. Well, it's actually not enough, and it's not until you experience, the joys of understanding them as a person and seeing them respond to you. There's an immense joy from that. The first time you actually recognise them responding to you, that's when it all changes, and it's beyond just meeting their practical needs.
So do you think any new mothers could benefit from this, or new fathers?
Absolutely. In fact, my husband's obviously observed me doing it. He's now picked up on that way of communicating with the baby, and again he's getting that joy from actually being able to communicate at that level. Likewise, I did take antenatal classes before having my child, and as I recall, there's a lot of focus on the childbirth itself and the pain relief and almost the practicalities of bringing up a baby, and less on communication and bonding and understanding the baby. Once you see the response, it's just almost like a wave. You just want more and more and more, and then that you find it's not something you've learned, it's just something that you do naturally.
So, if I've just helped that one woman, all my research has been kind of worthwhile. And just remains to thank EXRC, who fund the research, my brilliant research team at the top, and my collaborators. And thank you very much for listening.